the meeting in January.
All right,
Okay, January, which January meeting?
What? wait,
25th or the 11th?
1 second.
You need to call a meeting.
We need to call the meeting to order.
Who's in charge of it?
I will be the person who calls. We're calling the priority meeting to order. And we'll do a roll call. Catherine, it's Nandu?
Nada.
Nadu.
Yeah.
And here.
Roberta Manter.
Carla Black.
But I'm on YouTube, so it's fine. What's going on YouTube? All right. And so the purpose of this meeting is to figure out what the priorities of the commission is. Roberta is sharing with everyone a document that she uploaded. So I'm going to share my screen. And you can see what you handed out.
We're getting these in reverse. I don't have a printed copy for you.
It's okay. I have it up on my screen so I can read through it. Send that over to her.
Thank you.
These are just our brainstorming ideas.
So is there a outline that you guys have worked on before that you would like to, or a point that you would like to start with? Obviously, the terms we're gonna deal with in the terms subcommittee.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Because you are the foremost knowledge on roads, honestly.
Okay, at the January meeting, whichever the January meeting was, we went down through what the priorities should be and
January 11th.
in the report. January 11th. And in the report that we gave to the State and Local Government Committee, it went down through the things that we have been assigned to do. And then below that, it has the things that we identified as priorities. And the three top priorities were access, maintenance, and liability. So what I tried to do is just kind of brainstorm what some of the issues are with each of those and some possible things that might be able to be done about them. The way I love to explain brainstorming, you kind of throw out every idea you have, even if it's a crazy idea. And the great example that I have for that is I did up a bunch of course scenarios for 4-H camp to make the kids think about how they could work through problems. And one of the scenarios I gave them was you come out in the morning and find your horse has fallen through the ground floor and she is straddling a beam with her hind legs. She's calm, she's not panicking, but how are you going to get her out? And this is a real scenario that I ran across once. And my husband said, that's easy, cut the beam. And my first reaction is, what? No, you don't just let the horse drop. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. Maybe if you go down underneath the building, you'll find that her feet are already touching the ground, but she just can't get out. So yeah, cut the beam, get out of her way, and she'll be able to get out. So sometimes a crazy idea will trigger something that's a good idea. So some of these may be crazy ideas, maybe not, maybe some of them are things we can actually use. I realized that one of the reasons this problem has gotten so big is because it's so difficult to solve that nobody can figure out how to solve it. So they keep just kicking the can down the road and it gets bigger. And now we've got people that are losing complete access to their home. And you know, this has just gotten huge. Kathy Maher, who was here at the last meeting, she's still having problems. They got a restraining order, they got the gate taken down. And the other party filed another motion and got the restraining order rescinded on the grounds that they hadn't proved that they were likely to win their case. And so they thought, well, if it really is common law abandoned with no easement retained, that means the people who are blocking us in don't have an easement to get to their property either. So they went to the two first people on the road and said, would it be okay with you under the circumstances if we put up a gate? And they said, sure. So they put up a gate and the police promptly showed up and said, you have to take the gate down. She said, well, they've got a gate up on their property. And the officer walked in, looked at the other gate, walked clear down to the other end of the road, walked back and said, that other end of the road is not an access. This has got to stop. These gates are coming down now and they're going to stay down until the case is heard. Super. Then he got called up to active duty, I believe, and he's going to be gone for the next month. And now they're back to the other people's locked gate is back up again. So, and
What is
they're,
their reasoning?
we
What
have
is,
no idea. I asked them, I went to a selectmen's meeting where they were discussing the status of the road. And it looked like one of the selectmen had done such, so the woman had done a lot of research on it, and she had come to the conclusion that it qualified for statutory abandonment with a public easement retained, which would have been great, would have solved the problem. And the other two selectmen said, sounds good, but let's check with MMA first. And MMA said the town has no right to make that declaration. Well, under Title 23, Section 3028A, they do have the right to make that declaration, but probably because it's already in dispute, they're saying they can't touch it, which means it's going to sit in limbo for the next 2, 3, 4, however many years it takes it to get through court, because the courts are all backlogged since COVID. So
so I totally believe MMA doesn't know the answer. And they, they're siding with the town. So whatever the town decides,
what they don't realize is that the people are the town. The town is not town government. They protect town governments against their
the
people.
town works for the people, not the other way around.
Mhm. So anyway, the town backed off and didn't make any declaration, and there it sits in dispute. And the title insurance company is taking on the case up to a certain point. I don't know if they've got enough funding to see it all the way through to the end, but at least it's a start. And they have said, if you open up this can of worms, it's going to explode all over the state. And he said, well,
As
yeah,
it should.
this is a problem that's been going on for years, and the little guy doesn't have any power to fight it because it costs so much to go to court. And I know that from experience. And I also know from experience, unfortunately, that when the little guy tries to do it himself without an attorney because he can't afford an attorney, that the attorneys are very good at finding ways to get around it, finding loopholes, finding ways of misinterpreting the law or whatever. And the little guy doesn't know how to combat that. And the result is you get a bad decision, which sets bad precedent. And then you're in an even worse situation than you were in before.
So the bottom line is you either need an easement retained or you need a right of way.
Mhm.
And those are the two things that we need to, and really you can't tell the realtors that they need to add this to the deed. So where does it start to have this included in the deed?
Okay, they tried to do this a couple of years ago in 2017. They added a real estate disclosure law. The Realtors Association came up with the idea of adding it on residential properties, that you have to disclose if it's a private road. And I said, no, don't just say if it's a private road, say if it's a road that isn't publicly maintained. Because then it includes not only private roads, but also public easements, discontinued roads, abandoned roads, all these ones that are problems. And we got it through. And I said, great, that's good as far as it goes. That's for residential properties. We need it also for undeveloped land, because there are a lot of people who will buy a piece of undeveloped land with the intent to put a house on it. And they need to know this too. So the state and local government committee basically copied what had been done for residential properties, and they put in a disclosure. The trouble is that what we're finding is that the realtor asks the seller what the status of the road is, and the seller may not actually know. They may think they know, but they may be wrong.
They're gonna say what they need to say to sell the land.
That too. But in many cases, they say what somebody else told them. And we've found that you can go to two different selectmen in the same town and they'll tell you two different things. One will say you have a historic right of property access. And another will say, no, it's private property because it was discontinued. And so you get property owners butting heads at each other because they've both been told something by somebody official and they're not working on the same rules.
Is
So
this what's happening to this Mrs. Ma?
what happened with her is that her real estate disclosure said that the road was maintained by the abutters. This is another law that came in 2019, I think, that lenders were finding that they didn't want to give out a home loan for a property that might not remain acceptable because nobody's maintaining it. So they tried to copy from a statute in another state, which doesn't fit Maine. And I worked very hard with the committee to try to get it so that it would fit Maine. And thought we had it worked out, but somewhere or other something got changed before it actually got signed into legislation.
Is this through the state and local?
No, this was
No.
through judiciary.
Okay.
And what they wanted to do was to say that if there is any sort of road maintenance agreement at all, whether it's a formal road association or just a verbal agreement between the abutters, if there's any sort of agreement, that will stand. If there isn't any default, existing agreement, then the default position is that the abutters share equally in the maintenance. And they were going to say that the resident abutters share equally in the maintenance. And I said, you can't do that because you can have somebody who owns a huge woodlot or a gravel pit or a lumber mill or something, and they're going to be using that road with heavy trucking. You can't leave them out. They've got to share too. And they said, okay, yes. And they put that into it. But there was another paragraph further down on enforcement, and they took it out of that. So the enforcement only says that one residential property owner can sue another residential property owner to collect unpaid funds, which means that you have no recourse against the logger or the granite quarry or whoever. They can keep on using it and tearing up the road, and the poor residential landowner ends up paying the whole bill. So what we found has been happening since that law went through is that now when the realtor asks the seller, what is the status of this road? They will say, oh, it's a private road and the maintenance is shared by the abutters. That's the default position, but it's not always true.
So as a realtor, how can they, I mean, yes, you like to think you can take a person's word for it. But you can't always.
Right.
My daughter's a realtor.
Mhm.
She goes to the town
Mhm.
and she gets the information there along with what the owner seller is saying.
And so
But the problem
sometimes
is
depending on who you talk to in
that
the
the
town, you get
town,
two different answers.
yeah, in that's.
I have a question,
Sure.
and I don't know if you know the answer to this. When people buy houses here or land, does it go through like a title search?
If they ask for a title search,
So you don't have to have a
they
title
don't have to
search,
have a title search.
but most mortgage companies require a title search, don't they?
The title searches don't always get it right.
Oh, I know, but I'm just wondering
But
if that wouldn't, if it wouldn't be a requirement for the title companies to have to do that, because they're the ones with the research, the ones that are familiar with the deeds, should know how to research and go back
They
50
should,
to 100 years.
they should, but again, they don't always.
I'm curious.
Some of these people
I
are coming
know-
in with cash. That's another problem. They don't.
Well, that
Yeah.
that was
They don't
my
do it-
question,
They
like, I
don't do
know.
a title all the
Yeah.
time.
I know of
Bad idea
at
not to do a title
least,
search.
I know of at least 3 cases that are currently being looked at by title insurance companies because it turned out it wasn't what they said it was.
Uh-huh. But at least they have the title insurance to protect them.
In one case, the title insurance company wrote them a check and said, here's your money back, we're not going to cover it. In another, they gave them a partial check and walked away from it.
Mhm.
There Actually, there are 4 that I know, because there are 2 others where.
How can
the
they do
title
that? Isn't
insurance
that
is
breach of
working on it.
contract?
Excuse me?
How can the insurance company walk away from it? Isn't it breach of contract?
Apparently, there's a clause in the fine print that allows them to do that.
Huh.
Well, also too, like if you're spending all this money in court, who's gonna go after a title company with deep pockets? They'd be able to outspend you
Hmm.
5 to 1. So it does need to come then from some type of legislative. I was curious.
One of the cases, the buyer was told that it was a private road with shared maintenance by the abutters. It turns out that part of the road is no longer a road. It was discontinued without easement. But members of the public have been using it for years anyway, so it's still wide open. Well, not in an awfully good shape, but it's still travelable. And the other part of the road was discontinued with a public easement retained. And there are 4 abutters on the piece of road that this person bought a house on. One is him, one is a logger, one is a Boy Scout troop that hasn't visited their land in something like the last 10 years. And one is the town. So when it comes down to shared maintenance, he's it. The other 3 aren't going to contribute. So that one's with a title insurance company now. He actually ended up selling out, but he said the title insurance is still kind of work on it. The other one, again, the people were told that it was a private road with shared maintenance. It's not a private road. It was discontinued with no easement. And so it's all this little patchwork of pieces of private property. And for years, they all cooperated, got along fine. Everybody pitched in, everybody allowed everybody else access. And then somebody new came in, so it often happens. Somebody new comes in, says, oh, this is private. They buy a piece on one side of the road. And a couple of years later, they managed to acquire a piece on the other side of the road. Now they own the whole road and they block it. And that's what's happened to the Maras too. But somebody bought pieces on both sides, so now they own a piece all the way across.
But the law states that just because you own on both sides of the road is not owned by anybody in particular.
We have to have an easement.
If it's discontinued without easement, then you're on the center line. It's no longer a road.
Is that the Mars problem?
That's the question, is whether it's discontinued without easement or not. The neighbors are arguing that it was abandoned by common law, which is by 20 years of non-use and results in no easement.
How do you prove that?
And that's a good question. My thought is that the best proof of common law abandonment is that there are 20-year-old trees growing in the middle of the road. Because you can be pretty sure nobody's used it. And I do know one case where there's a cable that's grown so far into the trees on each side that the guy who bought the land had to cut down one of the trees in order to be able to move it out of the way so he can get in. That's pretty definite that it hasn't been used for a very long time. And he said then once he got past the cable, he had to cut down a gazillion trees to get up to his property because they were so close together you could maybe get through on a horse, but not with even a 4-wheeler.
Wouldn't the fact that there are houses on the road sort of refute the fact that they think it was
The
abandoned?
problem is that there weren't houses at the time they bought. And, the landowners thought, look at this, it's a beautiful piece of property, it's cheap, it's, I can have acres and acres all to myself. But they don't want somebody else coming in and doing the same thing. If there's common law abandonment, then there is still a public easement. I mean, if it's a statutory abandonment, there is still a public easement. If it's common law, there isn't. But the question is, how do you prove that the road hasn't been used for 20 years? The other thing that gets really sticky is that it seems to be generally thought that use by abutters doesn't count. It has to be public use. Well, what they're doing is they're confusing it with another statute or another argument, which is that in order to establish a public easement by prescription where there wasn't a road, you have to have public use. You can't have private landowners using a road and then saying it's now a public easement because we've used it for 20 years. It has to be the public in order to establish a public easement.
The landowners aren't public use. That's
Remind me to get back to that in a minute.
okay.
private landowners the abutting landowners using it for 20 years can establish a private easement. They can't establish a public easement because they're abutters, but they can establish a private easement. So then people look at that and they say, well, because you can't establish a public easement unless it's public use, then if there's no public use, it extinguishes the easement. And that it doesn't work backwards, because if anybody has used it, that should keep it open. Even if it's just the abutters who are using it. And if you think about it, to give you a drastic example, suppose you have a road that goes in for half a mile. It's got a dozen people that live on it year round. They all use it daily. They've been using it daily for 30, 40, 50 years, but it's a dead end. So there's no reason for the public ever to go in there. So somebody could come along and say, oh, well, because the public hasn't used it in 20 years, it's now common law abandoned. None of these people have access. That doesn't make any sense. So you've got to say that if there was any use, it should preserve the easement.
Yeah, get the public out of it and just use use, because gee, even the private citizen using it to maintain or to get to their home is a public use.
There is one case that agrees with you on that, and that's Gay versus Doobie. And what happened there was that the court said it was a road that had been discontinued, or a road that was being claimed to be abandoned, I guess. And one party was arguing that, well, because there isn't public use, the easement is gone. And what the court said was that use by abutters is a public use, because the reason that road was put there was to serve the abutters. It was put there as a public road for the purpose of serving the abutters, and therefore use by the abutters is the public use for which the road was designed.
So, for what would you suggest then? Where would you start? What would be the thing? What would be the priority that you would like to see? Like, what are the top 5 priorities or legislation you'd like to see happen to fix these issues? Maybe that's the way to do it.
One thing would be to define that common law abandonment requires no use, not just no public use, but no use by anyone. And one way to determine that is to look at the condition of the road. If there are 20-year-old trees growing in it, it's pretty obvious that there's no use. The one problem with that is that you can have 20-year-old trees growing in it, and some abutter comes along and cuts down all the trees, builds up the road, and it looks like it's a perfectly good road. Now, how do you prove that that was not used for 20 years because you haven't got the trees there anymore? So unless they took pictures first to prove that it was grown up, that can be pretty hard to prove.
So wouldn't you have to have a court case if it's common law that says that? You'd have to have a court
That's
case
the way
that
it is now.
decides that issue.
Yeah, that's the way
I
it
mean,
stands now.
no legislative process is
You
gonna.
have to look at the evidence.
is gonna
But
fix
if
that.
the legislation at least gives them a framework, if the legislation says it has to be no use by anyone, including abutters,
Mhm.
then that gives the court something to base it on. Then the question is, does that make it retroactive? Because getting into retroactive laws is really sticky.
Right.
There's a lot of ways to prove that the road is that had the 20-year-old trees. Now, he had to have a lot of trucks come in. And if there's people living on the road, then there's your witnesses to say, how did all this gravel get in there? And so there's a way to prove that, yes, those trees were there. No, they're not there now, but he brought in all this to create this road. So there is a way to do that.
There are some people who will claim
Don't
that
let it
it
go.
wasn't used from 1940 to 1960, and therefore the easement is gone. How are you supposed to prove that?
You can't prove that. Yeah, you can't, you're right.
Okay, so that would be one thing.
I believe the safety is the safety is a big priority,
Mhm.
and I just can't.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to bring either a fuel truck or a fire engine in the south end of the Mars Road. Unfortunately, I took some pictures of the worst washout, And my camera battery was dead and I didn't realize it, so I lost the pictures.
But they're not using. For rescue, they're not using the big box cars, they use an all-wheel drive, 4-wheel drive vehicle. So they can go anywhere now. So that being said, it's gonna be a little tougher for the fire truck, but when I say safety, chances are the only thing that's gonna go down there is a water truck for the fire department. And, you probably aren't gonna be able to save, and not gonna be able to save, but you need them to get there for rescues. And now that we don't all have the box trucks, towns are going to that 4-wheel drive vehicle, and it's going anywhere. So, because we deal with a lot of, I'm on the fire commission too. They deal with a lot of camp roads, because there's a lot of camps up here. So they found that they need to be able to get to them. They'll be able to get to them, but not with the gate. And getting out of their trucks and cutting off the lock is precious time that they don't have. So this is and I spoke with a few fire chiefs, and this is a big concern to them. They have been known to run them over, but you're not going to run over something that's a steel gate and like that. No, my thought is we as a town, any town, should put the people first. Not, they got to put the people that live on that road first, not the other way around. Not one single person who, for one reason or another, doesn't want. I can understand not wanting the public on your land, because I live on a dirt road and maintenance is tough. I can understand that, but for them to block off any kind of access for the people that live there for safety reasons, or any reason like that. Groceries, I can't even imagine. What do? Park outside the gate and walk your groceries in? That's fine right now. It wasn't fine yesterday when the rain. It's not fine in the winter. This is not fine. And safety is not always emergency vehicles. It's not us yet, but there's old people, and they've lived in these abandoned, or whatever you want to call these roads, all their life. This is what they know, and this is how we're treating them, by barring their access to their land. Some people just want to go up there. They don't have a house up there, but they have land up there. They grew up on that land. They want to go up and just visit that land. We're denying that. And I get a problem with that. We're denying an old person going up to relive his youth by just going up and looking at his land. It isn't just, to me, it's not just about emergency vehicles. It's a big piece of it, but there's also other things.
One of the cases that I keep coming back to is Jordan versus the town of Canton. The limited user highway law was passed in 1968. And it said that the selectmen of the town can just decide that a road is of limited use and value to the traveling public. And from that point forward, the town is no longer responsible for maintaining it, but it's still a public road. And it only took 2 years for it to make it all the way to the Maine Supreme Court. And the court said that a public road with no public maintenance will inevitably be destroyed. And that the rigors of Maine weather would speed up the process. MMA says that doesn't apply because that applied to a statute that was repealed. And what I say is, look at the language. It says that whatever the legal status is, doesn't matter what the legal status is. What matters is the practical and actual results of the governmental action. And if the result of the governmental action is deprivation of access, you can't do that without compensating them. And so then the question comes in, well, when you've got a road that's discontinued by common law or abandoned by common law, the person can lose all of their access. And there's no compensation for it. And their excuse in statutory abandonment is that, well, if it hasn't been maintained for 30 years, everybody knows that hasn't been maintained and they're not losing anything because they had 30 years in which to complain. Well, I've known people that have complained for 30 years and the town has done nothing. And unless you know that there is a law that says you can appeal to the county commissioners, that's the only place where there are teeth in law that can get a landowner to be able to go to somebody and have them say, yes, this road needs to be maintained. But then you look at the case of Perry Lamb in New Sharon. They did complain to the county commissioners. The county commissioners did order the town to repair the road, and the town just said no. And the county didn't want to spend the money to go in and have it done and bill the town, so they just let it go. So that doesn't necessarily work. You can have a road that looks like it's wide open and well maintained, and somebody buys property on it not knowing that it's a bin because one of the abutters is maintaining it. But the abutter isn't going to necessarily want to keep maintaining it for everybody else. This is what happened to us. When David bought the land in 1971, there was already a cottage standing on the property. It belonged to the town at one time. They'd taken it on a tax lien and they resold it without taking down the building. Now, how did they expect people to get there on a discontinued road? They discontinued the road while they owned it as, you know, on the tax lien, and then sold the property with the house on it to somebody else. How are they supposed to get there? So years later, my husband comes along. He's got PTSD. He's looking for a quiet place. He'd also just been told by his doctors that he had 6 months to live because they couldn't figure out why he kept getting pneumonia. And then they figured out he was deathly allergic to sulfates and running an oil company. And every time he cleaned somebody's oil burner, he'd come down to pneumonia. So he quit his job and didn't die in 6 months. But he owned this little cottage out in the middle of nowhere. So he started fixing up the road so he could get to it. Well, as soon as he started fixing it up, other people started using it. Logging companies started using it. We had another logging operation in there about every 2 years until they basically stripped everything that was worth cutting. And then we got a lull for a few years and then somebody came in and cut one more. But that, you know, every 2 years we'd end up rebuilding the road because somebody would tear it up and they were not responsible loggers. I know there are some who are responsible, but the ones we got weren't. So anyway, we end up fixing the road again and again and again. We finally got, you know, when the logging pretty much stopped, we finally got to where we could actually drive in and out with a 4-wheel drive car all the way through mud season, if we were careful. And then the town says, well, look, we got a nice road here. They started selling building permits to people. Now we've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got 4 other houses besides us on that end of the road. And when the people bought their properties, it was all before that real estate disclosure went through. And they just said, oh, there's a nice road. This is passable. It's, you know, must be town maintained gravel road. And it wasn't until after they bought their property that they found out we're maintaining it. And they don't particularly want to pitch in. They're paying huge taxes and getting virtually nothing for it. This is where another one of the possible solutions comes in that I've been trying to figure out. When a piece of property goes from being just a woodlot and possibly in tree growth, the town isn't getting much for tax revenue off of it. When it goes to being a residential lot, all of a sudden the tax revenue goes way up. And how much is it costing the town to have that person in there? Well, what are the biggest expenses in most town budgets? Schools and roads. If the people have no school-age children, they're not taking, you know, not adding that expense to the town, and they're not getting any road maintenance. So basically, the town is getting free money that they can use elsewhere in town because they're not having to put it back in to give anything back to those people.
But you're not gonna have anybody complain about giving to the schools, because I'm, you know, I don't have school age kids, I don't, but I'm glad to give to the schools. And that's a big tax.
Yeah, the
But-
difference is, when you contribute to the schools, you're not being asked to also build your own school and allow the public to come to it for free. And when you have a public easement, that's what you're doing. You say, okay, you can pay for the town roads, but you've also got to build your own road and let the public use it for nothing.
So
This is-
that's
this is
where
where
the,
the
that's
school-
where the problem is.
Yeah.
I am glad to pay my taxes to the school.
Mhm.
I don't pay my tax, of course, I pay my taxes for the, probably the roads too.
Mhm.
But
But what
I'm
I-
sure they're getting fixed somewhere.
What I'm saying is that when a town gets that much increase in revenue because of letting
Yeah.
a discontinued road
Something,
become
yeah.
residential, shouldn't some of that money,
Some
and I'm
of
not
that
saying the
should be-
whole thing, but shouldn't some of that increase
Be
go back
diverted
into
toward,
maintaining that
Yeah.
road, especially if the road is a public easement?
especially if
I
there's
wonder,
residents.
I'm sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, especially if there's residents living on it, then that a percentage should be put aside for that particular reason. That being said, that's gonna be a tough one. That's gonna be a real tough one to get them on board with.
Should we explore the issue of the minimal maintenance
Yes, yeah.
as a recommendation? I
Yeah.
feel like
If that would cut down a lot on.
if
the
a public
amount
easement is
of-
retained, maybe that should be a requirement of it, that there be some minimal maintenance
Mhm.
required.
Yeah, we've tried that before and
Yeah.
MMA has said no way.
Because of the cost of
Because
it.
it's an unfunded mandate, and I'm saying this is where the funding can come from, is from the
Mhm.
increased tax revenue that you get by allowing people to
Yeah.
build on the road. We put in legislation 2 years ago, it was, just during COVID, I think. That said that if a town, keeps a public easement on a road. And if they permit people to build on it, and if they then build them as residential properties. That they need to put minimal maintenance into that road.
Yeah, minimal maintenance of road if they meet the requirements. And
And what we were saying was that, part of the requirement would be if it's still a public easement. Because we can see that, doing this for every private road is not gonna work. But if it's still a public easement, the public gets to use it. And if they're taxing the people for residential property, and if they permitted them to build there. If you have those three things
wait, tax the people for,
for being on a residential property as opposed to just having a woodlot.
so really, and then the next one. So, okay, minimum maintenance of roads if they meet requirements. One of the requirements is if it's a public easement.
Yeah.
2, taxes people, taxes people pay for the residential property.
And the
Okay,
third one is if the town permitted them to build on the property.
So you put this that actual legislation in, and what was the sense of the committee at
And
the time?
MMA said absolutely no way, not happening because it's an unfunded mandate to put any maintenance in.